So despite the Pies going down by 3 points to the Crows, there were a handful of players that really stood out to me. A couple that didn't. Let's talk about it. So before we get into my 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 players, I do want to shout out a couple of them. Wil Parker. I thought he had a fantastic game. I talked about him in my review of the game. He had 2 intercept marks, 3 tackles, 10 disposals, 6 intercept possessions just in general. He's got the fight in him. He's got, I questioned why we sort of picked him. We could have went for sort of someone else. But I don't see him, maybe he's the one that probably makes way when Jeremy Howe comes back into the team, and that's understandable. But he did not step a foot wrong that whole game. And, those numbers aren't blowing up on paper or anything like that. But it looked like we might have found a really good small pressure defender, something that we've been kind of crying out for, but some guy that, he's putting his body on the line. And I really just loved his game. And I've been loving him in the VFL. And if he keeps getting this form into him, hopefully we see him get more games in 2026 in the senior team. Couple other quick guys just for their effort around the ground. Shooter had 22 pressure acts and 4 tackles. Not super good numbers with those tackles, but he was one of those guys, him and Bo, that were just pressuring and chasing. And, it was the intangible things that don't get put onto the disposal sheet or the stat sheet or anything like that. Bo on his return had 21 pressure acts and 8 tackles, the second most for a Collingwood player behind Jack Crisp's 13. So that was good to see, and he only played 70 or so % game time. So they were obviously managing his minutes. Shooter played 80% of game time. The other 2 that I want to shout out were Elliott and Membry. Both kicked 2 goals. Elliott notched up his 50th goal for the season. The first time we've had 50 goals in a season from a Collingwood player since Travis Cloke in 2013. He also had 7 tackles and a handful inside tackles inside 50. So the pressure and the tackling and all this sort of stuff were there for the Pies. It was really just that mid to forward connection. And we'll talk a little bit about a couple of players towards the end of this video. But I just wanted to give those guys just a quick shout out because they did play good games. Now, we'll start with my 5th best player on the ground. Now, these numbers aren't huge, but I loved Isaac Quainor's game. I thought, maybe not 2023 Isaac Quainer, and I'm sick of sort of when I talk about these players, I get sick of saying, oh, he's not in 2022 or 2023 form. Like, things happen and whatnot, and they're probably not going to recapture that for a while. But I thought his intercept marking and just his defensive work in general was absolutely fantastic. He had 3 tackles, 4 spoils, 5 1%ers, which is equal second for Collingwood for the team. 5 marks and 6 intercepts. Now, we need Isaac Quainer to fire up. He's been a bit low these last few weeks, albeit a lot of the players have been a little bit low these last few weeks. I don't know how proud he is of his game and wanting to sort of better himself, but I thought this was a step in the right direction and hopefully take that going forward. We know what he did in that final against Melbourne a few years ago, where he was just that marking beast. And I feel when him and Maynard are in the defense, I feel settled. Like, I feel calm when they've got the ball or when the ball's coming down towards them, because they're going to put up a contest. They're either going to take an intercept mark or they're just going to kill the ball. And that's something that I saw a lot of from Isaac Quainer yesterday. The 4th best player on the ground for me was Scott Pendlebury. Now, 24 disposals, but it was the 9 inside 50s, the 17 pressure acts, 8 clearances, and nearly 500 meters gained. This guy, I know he's getting better with age. We say it all the time, but he looked like a man possessed out there, like he was trying to right some wrongs of the last few weeks. He had a couple of turnovers here and there, but the effort and the structure, remember Craig McRae used him as an example in the press conference earlier this week, where he said, Pendles is one of the guys that's sort of worried about getting other people into position and not getting into position himself. And you have to put your own oxygen mask on before you can help out others. And I thought Pendles had that selfish game where he was looking after himself first, and then he went out and was helping others. So he led by example, and he had a really good game because of it. And this is the Pendles, when it's a finals-like atmosphere, this is the guy that you want in the middle directing traffic, and he did just that. Now, my top three players are pretty much split by a hairline. It was crazy, right? But for number three, I've got Nick Daicos. 29 disposals, 6 tackles. What I loved from Nick, though, 27 pressure acts. This guy just doesn't slow down. By his standards, he's had a couple of really low weeks, but 8 inside 50s, 8 clearances. He was in and under packs. He was tackling. He was getting the ball. And what I noticed, I don't know if you guys noticed it as well, he wasn't calling for it in stupid, silly positions, and we weren't giving it to him. There was one where Steele Cyberman had it about 60 meters out, and, Nick's calling for it. He's going, give it to me, give it to me. On the 50, you need to hit that short kick. Instead, we go inside 450, and the ball spills as a spoil, and that's a shit inside 50. So, like I said in the review, if we're lowering our eyes, if we're hitting Nick, he can either ping a shot from 50, like we know he can, or with his pinpoint passing, he can hit another target inside 50. So if we need to play that slow chess going around the arc, then we have to do that. But that's where he was calling for the ball in the correct position. But he has really improved. Maybe it was in the review that they looked at this, but he had really improved his game today compared to the last couple of weeks. He's getting smarter. He's getting more mature. People forget that he's so young still as well. So he's got a lot of growth. But I did see a lot of, kind of like, Pendle's maturity, I did see a lot of Nick Daicos' maturity come to the forefront against the Crows. Number 2, I've got Darcy Cameron. He looked like a guy that had just signed a 3-year contract extension and didn't have to think about a monster Godfather offer coming from the West Coast Eagles. Like, when I always say that football is played above the head. It's mentally as well. He looked like a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders. 7 intercept possessions, but 3 of those were contested marks. I floated the idea around in the review of this game that, Darcy Cameron could maybe flick forward a little bit when Jeremy Howe comes back and take some of those contested marks. It's going to be a fine balancing act. Because if you're going to use McStay in as a ruckman predominantly, or not predominantly, like as a second ruck, and not have him deep in, once we get Jeremy Howe back and taking those intercept marks and being that contested mark guy or that marking guy in the defense, why not flick Cameron forward a little bit and have him resting forward instead of resting in the back line? I hope we do see something like that if or when Jeremy Howe comes back against Melbourne. But Darcy Cameron loved this game. 30 hitouts, a little bit more to advantage than usual. 7 clearances. And here's one of the reasons why we were plus 12 in clearances for the game, where we've been low these last few weeks. He just looks like, I said, weight has been lifted off of his shoulders. Now, my number 1 player for the game was Jack Crisp. I had him in the blowtorch last week. He's had a very, the last handful of games has been really, really down. And it wasn't the Jack Crisp that we know. He moved into a wing position. Like, look at this heat map from Hawthorn's game where that's where he was getting his possessions. Now look at it for the Adelaide game. A bit more of that high half forward, running through the middle a little bit. We need to unleash him in the position that he knows and that he plays all the time, right? I like him in the middle. I like him off the halfback line, but the halfback line is crowded now. Play him through the middle. He's got the grunt, 13 tackles, 22 pressure acts, 6 clearances. That really nice goal that got me up and about in the last quarter, and 20 plus disposals. I don't like Crisp on the wing. I think we're wasting him now. I think we've got better players that can play on the wing. But I really loved Crisp's game, and he's one of the best finals players for the last decade, especially for the Pies. When the pressure's on, these players perform, and Jack Crisp proved that. Now, a couple of players that did disappoint me. We'll start with Patrick Lipinski. 10 disposals, got subbed out, was a tactical sub. 5 tackles, had 72% time on ground. It seems that when we were talking up Patrick Lipinski as that incredible kick going inside 50, he's just dropped off for some reason. You probably could start a conspiracy theory that it was getting dropped for, or not dropped, or managed for the Gold Coast game that stopped his continuity, but he just hasn't been that same Lipinski since before then. So he has to really start finding form quickly because there are a couple of players in the VFL that can take his spot that I'll talk about in a second. Another thing that I found weird, and it's not really a detriment to him, I thought Ned Long responded well from the last couple of weeks. He had 22 disposals, 4 tackles, still not above his 8 tackles. But what I noticed was that he had 69% time on ground, which was the lowest for a Collingwood player, besides Ed Allen, who had 8% because he came on in the last quarter. Now, in a game where it's, wet, in tight, contested, you need a big body. Why is he playing 69% of game time? I would have thought maybe close to 80. Is he carrying something? Are they sort of managing him for next week or for the finals? Which is interesting. I would have thought a player like that, yeah, about 80, maybe 85 is pushing it, because it's so weird. I've never looked at time on ground before, before, in all my years of doing Swoop Look, and even before that, until this year where Fly started saying we're managing players. Look at the numbers, look at the time on ground and see how we're sort of managing them and stuff like that. So yeah, that just struck me as pretty odd. If you have any theories, let me know down below. Now, the last guy I want to talk about, and I guess it's all the forwards I sort of want to talk about in general, is Dan McStay. So look at his 5-game average that's just popping up here. 0.44 goals in 5 games, 2.8 marks, 17.2 ruck contests, 9.4 disposals, 1.2 shots per game. Now, I know that Dan McStay is playing as a second ruck. This 5-game average, I wanted to sort of talk about it because for the last 5 or so games, he's had to also play in the back line. When Jeremy Howe went down, he talked about it in an interview where as soon as Jeremy Howe went down, he was like, oh, I knew that I had to go into the back line and play mainly as a backman. Before Billy Frampton was there, he had to play in the back line as well, and also do ruck contests, and also try and take as a forward spot as well. I think we're failing Dan in the way that he should be just a permanent forward, but we're making him take the second ruck now because we're not going in with a second ruckman, which is fair enough, I guess, because we don't have that second ruck because we're not playing Cox. But it's just a detriment to his game, and we're really, wasting him. And by the time he gets back into the forward line, he is absolutely gassed and absolutely cooked. Like, look at his heat map here. He's barely touching the ball deep inside 50. When the balls come in and they're on the top of his head and stuff, it's not looking good. And the same can be said for Brody Majek. He's hit about seven or 8 goals in the last 5 games. Didn't get a look in against the Crows. But even he had a down game by his standards. And you can say that it's a little bit, it's got to do with our mid to forward connection. But I just think the forwards aren't connecting as well as they did in the first half of the season. You can see them all clamoring over each other. There's no spread. There's no, marks on leads as much as there used to be. It's just bombing in long and hope. And yes, that has to do with the mids. But I just think there has to be a flick that needs to be switched in that forward line. And, people will say, oh, we need Bobby. Bobby's not going to help the midfield to forward connection. That's not going to work. He'll help if it drops on the ground. But with Dan McStay, are you going to drop him on the eve of finals? And who can you drop him for? Like, it'll only be Mason Cox, right? Because Mason Cox can play that second ruck. Cox in the VFL against the 17th place side had 20 disposals, 8 marks, 4 of those contested, 6 clearances, 6 intercept possessions, and 5 inside 50s. I thought Cox had a best or near a best on ground game against Port Melbourne. He's really pushing a case for senior selection. Could we see Craig McRae pull a bit of a selection surprise and drop either a McStay or, I hate to say it, but I'm going to say it anyway. Could you drop? No, you can't drop a Brody Majek because he does kick goals. He does have the runs on the board. Do you bring in Cox for Dan McStay? That's the big question. We talked about Ned Long and Tom Mitchell. Do you bring in Cox for a Dan McStay? Let me know your thoughts down below. The last thing I wanted to touch on, I mentioned Lipinski a little bit earlier, Ed Allen as well. Obviously couldn't do much because he was on for a quarter or if that. Roan Steele, right? 32 disposals, 9 marks, 2 clearances, 6 inside 50s as a pure winger in the VFL. I would, at this point, if you're going off stats and going off the look and feel of these players. Lipinski seems like he's a bit out of his depth at the moment. These last handful of weeks, 2-3 weeks, especially yesterday against the Crows. Roan Steele, can you bring Roan Steele in as a pure winger in place of Lipinski or in place of Ed Allen as a pure winger? That way it frees Jack Crisp to not play on the wing and play in the middle and as the that sort of half forward role that he's sort of kind of playing against the Crows. Let's Steele run into the middle as well. I think there's a lot of sort of moves that we can make, a lot of intelligent moves that we can make that they'll definitely be looking for against Melbourne. I don't want to reinvent the wheel against Melbourne. I don't want to make 4 or 5 wholesale changes. But there are a couple of guys that we are able to bring in if we want to see what our squad looks like going into the finals. I just can't believe that finals are in 3 weeks, 2-3 weeks, and we haven't got a settled side yet. It's really, really insane to think about. But those were my standouts. Those were some of the guys that disappointed me. Let me know who disappointed you or who stood out to you down below. But until then, like, comment, subscribe, tell your family, tell your friends, tell your pets. And until next time, double shackers. I'll swoop you later.